Hi, Anna Meyer here again with some more World Machine, and this is the last of the basic series, of my basic series of World Machine. And this time we're going to talk about how to get data out of World Machine, the export functions. And as you can see, I keep using the same terrain that we used for the other examples to keep consistency. And now let's have a look and see what the export functions look like in World Machine. And I go click on the device view so we can see all the devices. And here is the familiar part that we did in the previous videos. And now I've added a red group here, and I call this the output group, where I put all the exports. And the benefit of having the things grouped like this is that as things grow, you can just click and drag and move things further away to make room for stuff. And it also makes it a lot easier to see where things belong. So I love the grouping function. It works really well. And let's zoom in here and see what we can find in the output group. The outputs are dependent on two different types of data in this case. You can have other more advanced setups, but in the basic simple setup, it's depending on two types of data. One is altitude, meaning the elevation of the terrain, and the other one is the texture output that we generated in the previous video when we created the textures here. And so these two inputs come in, and then in this example, I only export one texture, meaning the green one you can see here. In some more advanced terrain, you might have seasonal textures. You might have textures with forest and without forest, and so on and so forth. So many different ones here. So you might have different texture inputs. So that one is an output by itself. And then we have the elevation input that I usually called alt, because elevation is another function for me. But alt here is the elevation of the terrain. And that one I go down here and I color it, and that's the one you can see here. If you just want to have a colored elevation like this, then I export that as one image separately. And then you have all the masks over here, and you have the elevation as a grayscale and height map. So these are the different types of outputs. And now let's go in and see what we can do with each of them, look at each of them separately. So before we go in and look at the specifics in this file, let's look at what the output types what type of data you can export from World Machine. And that you find under the output tab here. When you're in the devices view, you can find under the output, then you find these controllers here, and you have the bitmap output, and that outputs color, like texture, color bitmaps in various different formats. And that's used for textures and stuff like that. And then you have the height output, and that is a little bit of a misnomer because it's basically just a grayscale bitmap. So you have the color bitmap and the grayscale bitmap. And then you have something called library output, and that's something very different. So we're going to skip over that one and have it maybe in a future advanced video. And then you have mesh output, and that's when you want to use the terrain as a mesh in a game engine and in some other software, then you use the mesh output. I'm not using the mesh output here because that's something I rarely, or if ever, use in my workflow. So that's something I'll leave for the future video. And then you have two overlay views and scene views, and these are views, not exports really. So I'm not really sure what they kind of misplaced a little bit. So they ended up here in World Machine. And then you have a text output, and that's for like notes, and you can have XML codes and various stuff. I've never used it, so I've just read about it in the manual. So the ones that we will concentrate on today are the bitmap output and the height output. Okay, let's have a first look at the texture output here. And I'm using the bitmap output device. And when I double click on it to get to the properties, Then I can specify the file. That just opens a regular Windows dialog box here. I can put the name and I can set which folder it will export it to. And here I can set the file format. And for bitmaps, that meaning colored bitmaps, I have BMP, bitmap files, 8 bits, and I have TIFF, 8 bits and 16 bits, and PNG, 8 bits and 16 bits. So then you take the one you prefer. And the latest version in the development channel, the latest version of World Machine that is in the development channel, also supports JPEG. But the regular release of World Machine doesn't support JPEG yet, but it's getting there. And then you have, these are for tiled builds, so we don't cover that one. This, I think, is that if you select this, then it will automatically save it on every time you build this extent. Then it will simply save a version of the file. So I usually have that off because I do lots of builds while I'm figuring things out and working with it. And then you press this one if you want to write it straight out. That will start the build, or ask you to start the build. So these are the settings, and you can also select presets here. And then you can set the name of the device here, and in this case it's texture. I have a similar device here for elevation, for if I want to color code it. So the texture up here simply exports the texture map we generated here. But sometimes I just want a simple elevation coloring, and then I create that elevation coloring here in the colorizer, using a colorizer, and then I use exactly a similar output device, like I use the bitmap output just like in the texture. I just name it differently, and then I can export the elevation colored terrain. It's really neat to have both for during the editing of the file afterwards when you edit in Photoshop, but it can also be neat to have that as an option down the line. So I usually generate one just to go with it. The next one to look at is the height map export, and I have, for simplicity, I call mine Alt. That is my height map acronym. And when I open this one, the properties dialog looks very different. And the basic thing is here you can set the file name, or you can use the set button here, and then you get into the you get a file save dialog just like the Windows standard. And then you can set if you want this device to be part of tiled builds or not, and use absolute path or a relative path file name. That's the difference is if you, like I do, I use the files on different computers. So therefore I don't set an absolute path, because then I sync my files through Dropbox and stuff. So that's only if you're using it on several machines, then you have to figure out which setting you want to do there. And you can also save the file every time the World Machine is being built, just like the other one. And the important thing is to set the file format, and you have 8-bit precision and 16 or 32-bit here. And in the texture map, it doesn't matter that much, but here it matters a lot, because there's a huge difference in how good the terrain looks like in 8 bits. It's not Minecraft bad, but it gets bad. It looks a bit like Minecraft terrain when you have low precision, but sometimes it's enough. High precision gets you much better. I normally work with 16-bit TIFFs. That's good enough for me, but there is a 32-bit format, raw 32-bit. But I've had difficulty with various applications actually being able to read the 32-bit raw. So you have to kind of export different formats and see what you can do. And then you also have specific like Teragen or Leveler, and you have PNG and Povray TGA, and you have raw 16, raw 32, and so on, and PGM ASCII. These are various other, like PGM, Teragen, Leveler are for specific programs, and the HFZ format, I've heard about it, but I'm not really sure. So you have to kind of read through and study them. They are for different uses. But if for general use, TIFF 16-bit works really well. Most software like Vue and others, and Teragen and stuff. But Teragen is great for Teragen. So that one works if you want to use it in Teragen. Vue, then TIFF works well. So that's the setting here. So now we covered the textures, elevation texturing, and the height map. And the rest of them here are a special breed. There are two, all these are masks, and I'm going to talk about them separately. And then we have another one here that is an entirely special case in itself here, and that's the shadow mask. And that's the lighting of the terrain. So if I preview it here, you can see that you get the shading in a separate file, and that is really, really useful when you use, if you want to have a top-down map in Photoshop and like GIMP and so on. Then you can export the shading separately and then blend that on top and have the texture by itself, and it's amazingly useful. So therefore I always make sure that I export a shadow mask. And in order to create the shadow mask, I have a light map maker. That's a special device that you go in here and you can set it to ray trace or direct lighting. You can set how you want how sharp the shadows should be, and then you can set all the sun heading, altitude, and diffusion and stuff. And there you simply have to work with what you like, what gives you the result you like, so to speak. And then you can save these as presets up here. The problem with presets is that each time you upgrade World Machine, the presets seems to disappear. But that's one of the difficulties. So I rarely use presets. I usually use when I've set this, I just use a screenshot of the properties panel, and that way I can go back and redo them, because then I save them as a little screenshot image. So that's the shadow mask, and the shadow mask is simply just a height field, a grayscale bitmap. So I use TIFF 16-bit for that. So it's no different from elevation, apart that I'm giving it a different file name. And that's really important. Once you start having a ton of different exports, you have to make sure that you name them properly. Okay, time to look at the masks. And masks are grayscale images that you can use for a lot of different purposes, both in Photoshop, where you can use it to edit a top-down view of the texture and the shading and stuff. So you can select what areas to edit in Photoshop, but it can also be used in Vue or Teragen and other software where you use to render in order to place trees, materials, and other stuff like that. So they are very, very useful in many, many different ways. And the masks are simply a grayscale image like this. So if I look at we look at the slope mask here, and I go in and we take a look here. So the brighter an area, the more it slopes. So the flat areas like the bottom of the ocean and these plains are black, and the mountains here are white. So that way you can simply say, if I want to have rocky texture, for instance, then I take the white areas and the slightly gray ones, and you can dial that up and down in Photoshop or in Vue where you want to place things. Or I don't want to have trees in the white areas here where the mountains are too slopey. And you can do the other thing here. We can look at where it can just be a black and white thing, like the oceans are white and land is black. So that's another one, very useful. So you can quickly know where you put the blue in Photoshop, for instance. And the masks are just a height field output. So I use the TIFF 16-bit. Sometimes you might get away with 8 bits, but I usually go with 16 bits. It's a bit larger files, but you get the quality with it. So, and then you just give it a name, just like when the height field output. So it's the same device. You just give it another name, and that way you output it. But you see, I have some devices here first, and that's in order to generate the data. So first I have a selector here. So for the slope mask, for instance, we go back and have that selected. I have the select slope, and then I simply set the maximum and minimum to I lock them, and then I have the blend here. So if you look at the stuff up here, so I basically select nothing, and then I use the blend here, so it blends it from white to black. But in order to really be sure that I use the whole of the 16-bit, I use a clamp device and set it to expand. And that way I make sure that the data that comes in here are spread out from absolute white to absolute black. And that gives me the most use of it. And sometimes it seems to not work, so I don't really use it, but I put it here as a standard, and then I'll decide afterwards. Like here, the flat mask, for instance, I set everything that is almost absolutely flat. So I have things that are less than 0.02 degrees are being masked as masked away. So everything that is less than 0.02 degrees of slope is selected white. So that way, and ocean mask, that one I don't use the fall off. I just set it in this file. Everything that is below 375 meters or below is selected white. And then there's a bunch of special masks here. And those are the flow mask, the wear mask, and the deposition mask. And they come from Erosion. And to make it simple, I just put in an Erosion device here, and then I sift out and select the flow, the wear map, or the wear and the deposition maps, and then create masks the same way. If you want to be more kind of advanced and you have various different textures, you might have like a desert texture, and then you have like a forest area and stuff, and these have different erosions. Then you can, instead of putting in a new erosion device here, you can use the erosion device you have here and use these masks and export them as data. So then you need more than the elevation and texture here. But for simplicity, I've added one here, so I create a flow and wear and deposition masks. So that's the way of making it simpler. But you can also use the erosion data here. That will give you more precision, but it will make it a little bit more complicated to do all the piping. And then you have select roughness mask, and that's a new selector that appeared in World Machine like a few versions ago, and it's really neat. Everything that is kind of blocky, that has a lot of roughness to it, and it's great. So I create a roughness mask the same way here. So you can, if you look at it here, we can see that some of the mountain peaks here and slopes and stuff are rough, and the plains are kind of not rough. And that's a great way of adding some flavor to the texture. So in World Machine or in View afterwards, so you can use that as well. So when you have done all the settings right and you're ready to go, then you just press build like this, and that starts the build. And now I'm going to build this in 4K resolution, and it will take a while, so I pause the recording here, and then we come back afterwards when you look at the results. So now the build is done, and what we need to do next is to write down each of these files that have been generated onto the disk. And so I double click on texture, and I click on the right output to disk, and I will get a successful message. I've already done it, and so I'm not going to do it in this video, but you click this one and you get a successful message. And the same thing with elevation. And if you take the ones that use the height map, they look a bit different, but they have the same right output to disk button there. So once you've gone over all of the devices and made sure that you've written all of the files to disk, then you can just go and look at the results. And here we have the files. So here is the deposition mask, and we have the flat mask, and the flow mask, the lake and river mask, the roughness mask, the wear mask, the elevation or height map, the elevation coloring, the shadow or shading, I might say, and the slope mask, and the texture. So this is how you get the data out of World Machine. You export it this way. And next we're going to look at how to use this. That will be move into the realm of Photoshop, GIMP, or whatever image editor you will use, and look at how we can kind of use this and how we can make this look like a really cool map. And I will also have some videos on how to import this into Vue or similar type of software and make it into a 3D terrain and render it there. So thank you so much for watching, and now I'm going to head off to Gen Con. My flight leaves in a few hours, so I have to go down to the airport. So